Hello and welcome to this video on tone slash voice in narratives. That could be narrative stories, short stories, books, whatever. Professor Morgan here, also known as J. Lloyd Morgan, that's my pen name, trying to give you some insight on tone and voice when it comes to writing. All right, well, let's take a peek at something. So, how is tone and voice different than point of view? Because in point of view, it's first person, second person, third person, limited or limited omniscient. Those are the basic ones, and the tone of the voice is different. And the way that I try to think about tone or voice is this example here. Sometimes people are so distracted by how somebody is saying something that they are not listening to what they're being said. So he may be saying something like, "Your hair looks beautiful today," and she's like, "What? What are you talking about?" And he's got this bullhorn, and I mean, if he's trying to give her a compliment, to be nice, this is this the proper way of tone of voice to be using? Um, I would probably say probably not. Um, Another example, it's true story. So when I teach a face-to-face class for the first time, the first day, students walk in and I introduce myself as Professor Morgan and I take a roll. And as I'm going through the role, I'm trying to pronounce their names, and then I talk about English and how English is such an important language, and how difficult it is, and how what we're going to be studying in this class. And I use this really stupid, fake Scottish accent for about the first 15 minutes of class. And the students are kind of turning their heads and looking at me like, "What is this? Where's?" Yeah, and then I eventually say, "Okay, now I got a question for you. All right, where am I from? Any guesses on where I'm from?" And I get all sorts of weird guesses. People generally go, with Scotland, and then when I change back to my normal accent, they're like, it's fascinating because they all of a sudden they're looking at me like, who is this person? I did some sort of magic trick. I'm now a different person, and then I'll ask them certain questions that I had discovered in the previous 15 minutes, and often I'll hear students say, "You know what? I wasn't listening to what you were saying because I was too distracted by your accent and trying to figure out where you were from." So that's an example of, how the tone of voice can, be an influence on how what is being said. All right, so let's take a kind of like some ways that we can discuss this, and then we'll show you some examples. Okay, so the way that a narrator speaks, basically, to the reader in the passages of exposition and the backstory, is sometimes called the tone or voice of the story. So you have a narrator. Now, the narrator can be any number of types based on the point of view you're using and the approach you're taking to write a story. Okay, but every story has a narrator. Now, sometimes that narrator is, if you want to go really off the deep end, sometimes the narrator is reliable, sometimes the narrator is unreliable, but that's a whole different story for another day. But basically, someone is telling the story, okay, and it may be the person that's experiencing the story, it may be, somebody else. And again, you can check out my video on the different types of points of view if you're not sure what I'm talking about. But basically, it's how this is presented, how the narrator speaks to the reader, and how that's done. Now, how is that done? Well, in works in fiction, narrators are distinguished kind of by some of the following, not all of these. This is not an exclusive list, you know. It's how they form their sentences. Okay. Are the sentences, very short? Are they long? Do they always have the subject come before the verb? Do they have some variety in how they're writing? It's been my experience that our brains like variety, and good flowing writing generally means there's a variety in the way that sentences are structured, and the way that you don't want to have a whole lot of really long sentences that can really bog down the reader, or a whole bunch of short sentences. Again, now that sometimes that's appropriate depending on what's happening in the story, but how sentences are formed will help set the tone or the voice, right? And the choice of their words. Now, sometimes, depending on the story, the vocabulary may be very complex. And some people just, some writers love their thesauruses, where they're just going to be like, what's a big fancy word for this? Well, sometimes that's just the way that the style is going to be. And I kind of joke with some of my books, and actually one of them we're going to mention in this video is it's almost like you must be at least this smart to read this book, because some of the books are written for different audiences and such like that. So the choice of words, how wide and the vocabulary is and how uncommon the words are can definitely set the voice or the tone, and also the way that the narrators psychologically react to the events of the plot. Are they impartial? Are they just stating the facts, kind of how it happens? Does the narrator actually have an emotional or a psychological reaction to the different events? Because stories are about trouble, they're about conflict, they're about obstacles, and stuff happens. So does the narrator, are they just kind of sharing what's happening, or are they impacted by the events, and that then will maybe change how they're sharing the story? So let me give you some examples of some different stories, and this may seem self-serving, but I've always hated the question, what did the author mean? Well, I don't know, because I'm not the author. Well, in the case of these stories, I am the author, so I can tell you. Okay, so let's look at one of my books, Dark of the Shadow. So this is it's speculative fiction. It uses a hard magic system. It's very stylized in the way that it's written. It's told primarily from 4 different characters, different points of view. It uses third person limited. And each character, when it's their turn, the narrator is basically looking inside the head of that particular character. And how that character's personality is going to reflect the tone and the voice of how it's happening, because the narrator's kind of sharing what they're experiencing, what they're feeling, not the narrator feeling, but the character is feeling. And it may shift from person to person based on, and I have basically it's a character, per chapter. So there's a very clear break. So that's an example of how, you can look at how a tone and voice can change. Now you compare that to this story, Bring Down the Rain. So this story takes place in the late 1980s. I didn't write it in the late 1980s, but it's told from first person point of view. It's told from the character. His name is Derek, and so it's solely from his point of view, and the whole story is just first person. And so the narrator and the voice and the tone absolutely is Derek's experiences, and it changes based on whether he's having a good day, a bad day. Good stuff happens, bad stuff happens, and the narration is also kind of his quirky sense of humor and the way that he looks at life. It's really his personality. Okay. And then the third example I want to bring is The Mirror of the Soul. Now, this is probably one of my more interesting books that I wrote, because I wrote it with, in conjunction with Chris de Burgh. Chris de Burgh is a musician, probably most famous in America for his song "The Lady in Red," and he's sold millions and millions of albums across the world. And he wrote a song called "The Mirror of the Soul," and I thought it was such an amazing song that it inspired me to want to write a book. And I got in contact with management and in contact with Chris, which was awesome. And so I wrote this, and this takes place right after the 100 Years' War in southern France. So I had to do a lot of research, and I listened to a lot of Chris de Burgh songs while I was writing this, and I really tried to capture his voice and his storytelling technique in doing this writer. So this one I was actually kind of borrowing his, and trying to emulate his storytelling technique. So that also was kind of a way that you can approach it. So some final thoughts on this. So how do you know which tone or voice to use? Well, this has been my personal experience. As the story starts to unfold, the author tends to find the tone or voice as the story, of the story as it progresses. Okay, so as I start writing, I'll write and I have a general idea of who the characters are, the setting, the premise, and where it's kind of going, and it will start to progress. And then I found that usually as I kind of get into a book, several chapters, then I really start to find my tone and my voice. And part of my revision process is I always go back and rewrite the first few chapters, because it's not until I've written quite a bit, several chapters, do I actually kind of start to understand what tone of voice I'm going to use. So this is yet another reason why revision is such an important part of the writing process, because you don't want to have different tones of voices that are going to be conflicting. So anyway, hope this video helps you give you some insight on tone and voice. There you go.